Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. So, what really drives change in organizations and what quietly kills it? Why do some initiatives build real traction while others fade out, even when the intent is strong? Anyone who's tried to execute a strategy, shift a culture, implement a new technology, or lead through uncertainty has felt that gap between what we intend to happen and what actually unfolds. And it's often not about the plan, it's the way things actually interact. And that's a space our esteemed guest understands deeply. We're absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. Jean Boulton today. She brings a distinctive blend of scientific learning and training, senior strategy and change experience, and a long-standing interest in complexity and Taoist thinking, especially the idea that progress often comes from working with the grain of things rather than forcing them. Jean is a theoretical physicist by background and studied at Oxford University and then the University of Cambridge. Her field of study was quantum physics, and she then moved into engineering, strategy, organisational consultancy, and hands-on management as well. Jean has been deeply involved in the science and philosophy of complexity. She teaches worldwide postgraduate programs in international development, systemic change, engineering, holistic science, management, sustainability, and community engagement. I don't know how she finds the time to do it. She's also a fellow at the Institute of Physics and a visiting academic with the Department of Social and Policy Sciences at the University of Bath and with the Cranfield School of Management. In 2019, she was appointed as a research fellow at Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study in South Africa, and she's authored two brilliant books, Embracing Complexity and The Tao of Complexity, published in 2024. And inevitably, Danny is now, for those audio viewers, is showing the book and all of the brilliant post-it notes from her as well. The reason why we have loved to invite Jean on is because she has a lovely, accessible way of writing that really opens up a whole new way of seeing the world.
Just to kick us off, so you've been, as Gary said, you've been exploring that kind of science of complexity and its implications for organisations and individuals and globally. And you've just written that book, The Tao of Complexity. That's your latest book. So why did you write that book, and who did you have in mind as the reader when you were writing it?
I guess one of the things that I feel exercised about in this kind of idea of the world being complex is it, if you like, the world is complex whether we like it or not. It's not a choice. If we ignore that complexity, it doesn't go away. We just do a worse job of living and working in the world. So it comes from that kind of strong belief. It's complex, but that's not the same as just going, it's complex, get over it. It's complex, tough, bickies. It's the science of complexity. Has a lot to tell us about the nature of that complex world, which then helps us to live and work well within it. So I came across complexity thinking, a long time, longer than I care to admit, but certainly by the 1990s and probably earlier. And it really made sense to me. And through a variety of coincidences, I started to work with Peter Allen at Cranfield University, who had been a postdoc and had worked with Ilya Prigogine. So I was in this lovely position of being able to understand the science of complexity through the horse's mouth, so to speak. He was a theoretical physicist, and so was I by background. So it gave me a way to actually discuss it with him. And although I was more, by this time I'd done an MBA, I'd been in management and management consultancy, I was able to kind of, in a sense, translate and work with his ideas, but really understand them deeply. So it was a great privilege to be able to do that, and that led into the first book. But this idea of what is complexity, not a model of complexity, not a simplification of complexity, but as a scientist, what are we talking about when we talk about the complex world is what's really driven one of the reasons that I've written this book. And there's a tradition through the science of open systems that really was coined, I think, in my view, by Ilya Prigogine and others too. But that's the tradition that I've been interested in. Similarly, biologists were Stuart Kaufman, Maturana, and Varela. Brian Goodwin, there was a kind of tradition of biology as well, which was really, in a scientific way, was saying, well, how do things change? How do things self-regulate? What does flow mean? so they had very similar ontologies, worldviews, coming from this tradition of the thermodynamics, the physics of open systems. And when we talk about open systems, what we mean is that the classical science assumes that a system is closed. So when Newton looks at the physics of the planets going around the sun, you assume nothing can get in and out of this box where you can then do the maths. The maths is practical. But as Prigogine pointed out, most situations of interest are open to their wider context. And it's the kind of the exchange of energy and resources with the wider context that allows patterns and form to emerge. So that was very interesting for me to look at this kind of real grounded science through physics and biology and say, well, what does that look like in practice? So that was one reason for writing this book. The other theme that I brought into this book, and it's obviously called the Tao of Complexity, is something that Peter Allen recognised many years ago. I tell the story at the beginning of the book of Peter Allen rocking up at having been to a meeting in London and came back with this copy of the Tao Te Ching and said, look at this. The introduction to this reads just like a complexity theory textbook. And I was already interested in Taoism, but it was like, wow. So I took the book off him, obviously, and nicked it and read it. And it really entranced me. This question of how 2,500 years ago in China could they come up with such a similar worldview to all this highfalutin science stuff and end up in the same place. Maybe there's something in it. It's more than an opinion. Maybe we're understanding something that's quite a grounded understanding of the way the world works. And if we understood that better, would we do a better job of it? So that was the kind of the impetus for writing the book. And I wanted to write the book for people that weren't scientists or weren't steeped in these ideas to find it accessible. And I really try and write in very ordinary language. That's my intention. And it came to me. It was kind of a journey of writing the book. It drove the publishers a bit mad because in a way the book emerged, and they don't like that. They want you to tell them at the beginning what you're going to write. And I kept going, well, yes, but I was just thinking. They were very accepting of me working in that way. But I wrote it in short pieces. Mm-hmm. In a bit like the way the Tao Te Ching itself is written, short, slightly paradoxical, overlapping pieces that kept trying to drill down into ideas from different angles. And I wanted to write a book that allowed you to explore the nuance of these ideas, not just go, oh, emergence, I've got that, I've done emergence before, tick. But what does it really mean? When I, for example, came across a podcast by Stuart Kaufman talking about emergence, and this is a field I've worked in literally for decades, and I'm going, oh yes, how interesting. I hadn't looked at it from that point of view. So I wanted to write a book that both interrogated the core ideas from different angles, but very much through stories and examples and challenges, got people to think about what it meant for how to live and work in the world, not just in organisations, but looking at global challenges, but also looking at what does it tell me about me? What does it mean to say I'm an open, complex system? And Prigogine, one of his first books was called From Being to Becoming. And what he was emphasizing in that statement is this view of the complex world is a processual worldview. It's always becoming. And the paradox is it's the very movement in a self-regulating system. It's the very allowance of movement that creates stability. So that's a sort of paradox in that sense. But we have this idea of things are always changing. They're always adjusting. They're always moving. They're always flowing. Sometimes they adapt. Sometimes they don't adapt. They collapse or they get locked into unequal and very power-driven and rigid structures. For example, when we look at our global world at the moment. So I wanted to really emphasize this idea of process complexity and a processual worldview, which I haven't invented. It was something that Prigogine talked about, but I have emphasized perhaps and brought to the fore in, I hope, a fresh way. So that's what how I've written it and why and who it was for.
Fabulous. I really appreciated the structure of it and the kind of vignettes of kind of just to get you thinking at things different ways. So the other thing that's probably worth noting is the illustrations that are kind of dotted throughout the book. Where did they come from and what were they?
Oh, that's a terrific story. Most of them, I persuaded my long-suffering publisher to let me source the illustrations myself, and I had a really strong idea about this book. You know, I wanted it in black and white. I wanted the page layout so that every section started on the right hand side. You know, I had this real visual. I quite like design and visual images, you know, so it mattered to me. But through Facebook, I discovered somebody I knew a little bit in Frome, where I live, in my local town, who wasn't an illustrator, but just kept putting up stuff on Facebook, and it was really nice art. So I went to see him and said, you know, do you think we could work together to find a way to illustrate the book? And it was a really interesting journey, because how do you do that? You know, I wasn't going, you know, I want you to draw this. I was trying to co-create with him a kind of feel of an image that conveyed a sense of something, a sense of unraveling, or a sense of flow, or a sense of, you know, a very, you know, rigid structure. And we kept meeting. This was over quite a long time. And we found that the best way to work was we'd find some images in Pinterest that I liked and kind of conveyed something. But we then had to talk about what it was I was seeing in them. So what was the sense, the quality that I was trying to portray, so that he could be both inspired by the image, but also inspired by what I was hoping to convey through the image. And we got better and better at it. It was incredibly interesting. And for example, the cover image, which I hadn't wanted to put on the cover, but when the publishers saw it, they said, you have to have this on the cover. And he did that really quickly. And we found a picture. And there's something about the quality of the silence it conveys, you know, that the little boy is, you know, walking on a beach, you know, it's got an internal focus. It's a moving focus. It's got water, you know, it grabs you as a kind of serious inner thinking book, doesn't it? From that image. So most of it was through him. Some of it, there were some quite interesting stories of working with a group in Frome who was supporting Ukrainian artists and loving some of their work. They had an art exhibition, and having this engagement with a woman living in Kyiv over the last couple of years, and conveying, I had two of her images in the book, and they just got me, and I was able to work with her through translators, you know, and to work out what we were trying to do. So yes, it's been a sort of political thing, and a very enjoyable, itself a path, you know, about relationship and conveying intent, and, you know, a co-creative endeavour. So it's sort of, I wanted the book and the writing of the book, in a sense, to be a representation of the path that the book is about, so that the medium is the message.
So we've talked about the word complexity, and we like a definition on the OrgDev podcast, because the audience will be at different points in their understanding. So how do you describe complexity, and how does that shape your view of organisations?
So I find it difficult to say something succinct about complexity, unfortunately. I get this all the time, you know, in pubs, like, well, what is complexity? It's like, oh no, not again. The science of complexity, which is what I'm interested in, is the science of open systems. And by I don't always use the word system either, but what I'm talking about, if I give you an example of a family is a good example of a small open system. So what do I mean? Well, we wouldn't forget, with it being a family, that a family is comprised of people interacting relationally and affecting each other. So there's a diversity. The things in the family, like the people, are changing and affecting each other. So I'm both affected by, you know, when I go and see my mum, I'm not quite the same person as when I'm talking to you, you know, so there's a way in which I shift in relationship. And some of that, as a family culture, stays with you, and the family culture remains, and some aspects of it kind of are more context specific. So if you look at a family, the characteristics it has of a complex situation, if I put it that way, is it's open to the wider context. Grandma might come to stay, people go to school, we buy a dog. There's things going on in it, so it's open, it's diverse, and it's relational. There's a relational reflexivity. So I affect my brother affects me back. If my sister's there too, my brother and I's relationship is slightly different. It's all kind of moving. But in a kind of adaptive family, you often find that there would be certain patterns of relationships and patterns of doing things that would sustain a good adaptive family. If dad can't cook the tea, then mum can cook the tea. If grandma comes to stay, people move the bedrooms around, it doesn't seem to matter. And let's say if there was a fire in the house, the family would be able to regroup, maybe in another house, and find their way. That would be an adaptive, patterned response that's co-created. It's continually refreshed by those relational interactions and norms and ways of doing things, but yet it's flexible at the same time. It's got that paradox of both and. So that would be an example of a complex system. And an organisation, in a sense, is no different. It's just bigger. It's got people in it that are interacting, and an ecology has got plants and animals in it. But the complexity perspective doesn't forget that there's a sort of micro level, a granular level, and it's the kind of reflexivity that we're taking account of at that level that then allows us sometimes to build up to cultures or norms or patterns of relationship that can seem relatively stable. But I want to emphasize that for a lot of people, complexity and complex adaptive systems, for example, is a phrase that's used a lot. But who said it was a system? That's an assumption. Sometimes things, morph into, where are the boundaries? How are there boundaries? And who said it was adaptive? That the science of complexity says sometimes things adapt, sometimes they collapse, sometimes they become chaotic. A family's still a family, but some families are very rigid and hierarchical. And, maybe if there was a fire and the main, the mum or the dad in charge wasn't there, people wouldn't know what to do. Some families are very chaotic. They have very few repeating patterns. Whether you get fed and when and who does what is much more chaotic. But they're still interacting. They're still complex situations. But we mustn't assume in the science of complexity that things necessarily adapt or are stable or can have defined boundaries. That the science of complexity will tell you in what ways are things stable and why, in what ways are things unraveling and why, in what ways might they be, locking in power and starting to become very rigid. They're the kind of questions I want to ask. And also that many of those things are going on at the same time. So I was talking with some international development students about DRC, the Congo, and they were saying, well, surely that's just chaotic. Myself and their lecturer were going, well, yes, many aspects of that are chaotic, but within that, you will find tribal structures and tribal relationships that will continue, or family relationships, or the way, some aspects of farming. There's always, in a situation, there will be some aspects that are more stable and adaptive, and there will be other aspects that aren't. But we shouldn't preconceive that we're in one regime or the other. It's about patterning. So my one-liner about this would be, it's about understanding patterning. And I use that word rather than systems because it's more subjective and it's more fuzzy deliberately. What is the pattern of behaviour in your family? If I was a social worker, you don't want me to come in and tell you. It's not an exact science. There would be something that we might agree is a norm and a way of working in your family rather than yours. So what we're interested in is the emerging, stabilising and ultimate dissolving of patterns of behaviour and relationships. That's the core for me of the theory of complexity.
I wish I'd met you 25 years ago when someone was trying to explain complexity to me for the first time. That's so interesting, because I love the idea of patterning. So, do you mind if I just ask a couple of questions about what we've just shared there? Because there's so much to unpack in that.
No.
If we use the family example, patterns aren't necessarily always between individuals. They can be almost intergenerational, can't they? So could there be an instance where a family, there was a pattern between two people in a previous generation that gets sort of handed down, or is it just something that's generated between two people in the moment?
So I'm not talking about a pattern between two people even. I'm talking about, I might come, supposing if you looked at organisation culture, or suppose I was a social worker and came to visit your family, I might say that one of the behavioural patterns I notice here is a calmness, a regularity of meal times, a willingness to help each other. They would be behavioural patterns that have resulted out of reflexive relationships between the whole family, but are kind of abstractions of or descriptions of a general way of behaviour, if you see what I mean. Now, some of those patterns, you're completely right, and it's one of the things I emphasise a lot in the book, is about the importance of history, because some of those patterns will have been established long ago. They will be almost like, the way what my mum did. You either do the opposite, don't you? Or you do the same, or you mean to do the opposite and you do the same. It's when people say you're big turning into your mother, it's like everybody's nightmare. So there's a historically shaped. So some patterns of relationships, if you looked at how is France different from the UK, some of those historically shaped cultural norms have sustained over a long time. If I sometimes talk about the town where I live, what's made Frome have the culture it has. That's a pattern, behavioural pattern. It's co-created through relationships, but it's more than between two people. And what you're dealing with always in change, in transitions. So complexity is both saying what's stable and how does it transition, what makes things stabilise and what makes things transition, is you will find that sometimes patterns will collapse. Sometimes they go underground and sometimes they collapse. So if you look at some of the ethnic tensions, tensions is a cool word for some of what's going on in the world. They go back centuries. They have never gone away. They might go underground for a bit, but until they're kind of surfaced and healed and dealt with, and that's an extremely difficult thing to do, those patterns are kind of still there. There are other things that become new patterns. So in a sense, the neoliberal pattern it has been a relatively new one, over the last 30 years or so. It's become established as a new norm, and it wasn't particularly there. So and the old norms, perhaps are still there in vestiges. So that's how I would think about it. But bringing in the historical aspect is really important.
And I guess the invitation to participate in those patterns is very strong, isn't it? And often it's unconscious as well. So you talked about the word reflexivity. What does that mean, and how can people practice that?
Well, I think you bring in a good point, and it's the same in organisations. The way I try and describe complexity in the book is not just a sort of real thing about model, real things interacting in a way that could be modelled, but we all bring our unconscious history to work. That when you're, for example, I sometimes talk about attuning. So supposing you were a consultant or new to an organisation and you join a meeting, then part of what you're doing is you're trying to attune to the vibe, the ways people do things, who's who, where does the power lie, how do decisions get made here, what's the way of behaving. So there's a kind of attunement. Now, when you do that attunement, you're doing that unconsciously, or you might be doing it deliberately, but your intuition, your kind of unconscious processes are part of you sensing into that.
One of the founding fathers in the organisation development field is Kurt Lewin. A lot of his thinking is carried through to today, but one of the sort of the change models that he kind of brought with him, it hasn't necessarily stood the test of time, and that is the freeze, unfreeze, refreeze approach to change. Yeah. What's your perspective on that as an approach, and how does it sort of compare against complexity?
That's a great question, Garin. Well, I think that if I was trying to change, supposing, which we've all done. I go into an organisation and they want to create some sort of change. Okay. Part of what I'd be doing, and I go through this period of sort of diagnostic, of apprehending things. And I'm trying to, through reading things, talking to lots of different people, talking to people at different levels in the organisation, if I can, talking to customers and suppliers, people who've left the organisation, trying to get as rich a picture as I can of the way this organisation works. I'm looking for what's really tight and strong that needs preserving. So, for example, I did some work years ago for Unilever. Unilever talks a lot about their sustainability culture. And so, part of what I was doing was prodding it, and kind of saying to people, is this just pretend? And everybody's like, no, it is not pretend. And you kind of felt that my felt sense was this is real. It's not just a pretend. They didn't just parrot these words. People deeply felt, not everybody obviously, but people deeply felt it. So in terms of change, that was something that was not frozen, but was certainly embedded, and one wouldn't want to do anything to unpick it, to destabilize that. But you're kind of looking in a mixture of, are there new growing shoots? Are there new things starting to bubble up that we could really protect and support in growing? Or are there things that we really are trying to help collapse? I think that it's all true. So I think the idea of, sometimes it's a bit like the one who goes, the emperor has no clothes, isn't it? You sometimes, as a consultant or as a new manager, are trying to find ways to destabilize, to disrupt, to bring attention to something. And you are, in a sense, trying to unfreeze. But there's sometimes when you, alongside that, are seeing that the job is sometimes about cohering. And I think that I do have in the first book I wrote, there's a thing about the life cycle of a forest as a way into this. It is talking about, collapse, which is almost like the unfreezing, and then the refreezing is how it grows. But I think I see all that going on in different amounts, but I'm looking at all that at the same time. And sometimes the job seems to be, golly, these guys just, they need a bomb up them. They're so rigid. Because, how do I find anything to rock, their certainty, their self, their complacency. And then, there are other situations where you think, and what's really needed here is for them to get some confidence that they're doing some good things. We just need to protect and cohere, and then for them to learn from each other. And it's all at the same time, I think. I don't disagree with Lewin. I just think it's more complex than that.
And it sounds like there's a certain amount of precision about it. I think sometimes we see senior leaders that are given the mandate to disrupt things, and it's kind of like a blind disruption. Whereas I guess your sort of proposal there is sort of stabilize and strengthen what's working, what's emerging that's potentially good and could be the vehicle for positive change, and also disrupting and shifting what's stuck or harmful.
Yes. So I make a big thing in the book and in my work about differentiating between what I call apprehending the context. So spending time not just on my own, but looking at the past, present, into the future, looking systemically, looking at different aspects to it. If I was doing it for a region, I'd be looking at as sort of the political, economic, social, environmental, those kind of strategic things, but looking at them more systemically and looking at them more dynamically, looking at how those things are emerging. So you get this very rich, complex picture, and then you're helping managers. And you can do the same thing within an organisation or within the context. Say, well, so kind of what's, how do you see this? What's stable, what isn't? And where are the kind of nodes and the opportunities and the cracks? So you're doing a lot of that, and you're using judgment, but starting through multiple perspectives to hone in on, like sustainability. That's a really important value. Let's really make sure that we test whether what we're doing would send the wrong messages to our staff. So you're doing a lot of apprehending with this complex world, but out of that, you then start to say, well, why don't we start here? Or here's an opportunity. So it then becomes, in a sense, more programmable. But don't do that until you've really worked in quite some depth with the richer picture. I talk about simplicity on the other side of complexity. And what I mean by that is if you stick with the rich picture, sometimes you go, oh, here's a hill and here's a valley, and here's a little stream. I've got those now. Now I can work with those. Whereas if you simplify, if you say, well, we're only going to look at this part of the problem and we're defining the boundaries here, you might miss the very things that are the systemic opportunities that you wouldn't see until you hoover out. And that's what I think the phrase is. For simplicity, this side of complexity, I wouldn't give a fig. But simplicity on the other side of complexity, if you embrace the rich picture and then stand back from it, that's really where you start to say, do you know what, I'm starting here, or that's worth doing, or this is important. And I think, part of what you have to do in organisation development is try to help leaders gain more confidence in their systemic thinking and their use of judgment. And I think we train that out of people in today's world much more. People are much more scared than they used to be to use their judgment.
I think it's really, the simplicity on the other side of complexity is one of the things that stuck with me from kind of reading the book. I really enjoyed that. And I think it's countercultural, isn't it? If, you've got a consultant going in or a new leader joining an organisation, there's this kind of pressure and this rush to make a difference. You need to deliver something. So taking that time to step back and see the big picture and the rich picture and apprehend can be really countercultural and quite difficult to do for some people.
Yes, I remember one client. I knew the HR director personally. Not very well, but I knew her, and I was working for one of the directors, and apparently the director phoned her up and said, "Is this woman for real? She wants to do all this diagnostic stuff." And Susan, who was the HR director, said, "No, it's okay. You can trust her." And the way I sell it is to say, look, you pay me for the diagnostic. I'm going to work with all your people. So I'm already moving people along and getting them to think differently. And then we'll decide what to do. And then we'll do a pilot. So we're not doing a big thing. We're not doing a whole top-down big thingy that I'm selling you because I've done it somewhere else. I'm saying we're going to completely customize it for you. But all you've got to pay for is the diagnostic. And that's going to be team building, bringing people along, getting them to think differently. Then we'll try something out and see what happens and learn from doing something. So it feels, in putting it that way, it feels safer and cheaper and gets them more comfortable. And the other thing that I've always done is if they go, oh, no, we don't want to do that, I say, okay, well, I'm not the consultant for you. Then they listen. You know what I mean? It's a good selling. Going, I'm walking away. It's like it works in souks, certain parts of the world, and it works in organisations because they're so shocked that you're not going, oh, I'll do anything for the money, that it can be a really useful thing to do.
Hi, we're just pausing this interview for a moment. Have you ever finished an episode of the OrgDev podcast and wish you had a cheat sheet that summarises all of the key points? Us too, so we made one. It's called From Pod to Practice, and each week in our newsletter we'll share a 2-page summary of the latest OrgDev episode, and it includes key takeaways, a reflection prompt, and one small action you can try.
And it's all in a digital format with space at the end to add your own notes and reflections, and it's designed to help you take the learning from the podcast into your day-to-day work. So to get your copy, just sign up to our Next Step to Better newsletter. The link's in the show notes, or you can visit our website at www.distinction.live to get the latest From Pod to Practice in your inbox. And let us know what you think. We'd love to get your feedback. The other thing that we hear a lot of talk about is kind of certainty, and complexity brings with it uncertainty, and it's how do you marry those things? How do you find a way for people to move forward when everything's unpredictable? So what's your view on kind of how leadership can kind of embrace complexity and that uncertainty but still help people move forward and not just be like paralyzed by the complexity, I guess?
Because people have become very tutored in left brain thinking, what people hear when you say things are uncertain is they hear chaotic. So it's a bit like people feel it's better to pretend to be certain than to handle a level of ambiguity or uncertain. But the complex worldview doesn't say things are random. it says there's a level of uncertainty in how the future unfolds. Sometimes the present unfolds relatively predictably. Sometimes things emerge and the radically new appears. But it's not random. That the pathways that are possible, the possible futures, are not infinite. They're constrained by what's already happened in the past and by the context. So I kind of try and reframe uncertainty is one thing. And then I find in working with organisations, if I can possibly get away with it, I don't use any language of complexity. I mean, it's because I've written books now, people kind of want me to go in because of that. But back in the day, I didn't use any language because it gets in the way. But I would use things like, have you been involved in developing a business strategy? No, yes, they say. And I say, well, and did it go to plan? How many times does it go to plan? And by and large, most people say, 90% of people say, no, it didn't go to plan. And I say, well, why didn't it go to plan? And then they describe the ontology of the complex world. Well, things happened that we didn't expect. The world changed around us. We had new competitors. Somebody left the organisation. We were let down by another department. We didn't understand what was meant by. And they describe an emerging, adapting, complex world that sometimes does things that you really can't. Emergence is you can't really know what's going to emerge. It's not to say that things are radically new all the time, but sometimes they are. You have to bear that in mind. That's the first thing. So they're starting to go, well, you're right. And then we come up with examples of where when you pretend it's certain, when it isn't, does it cost you more money? Is it effective? And so they kind of go, well, no, not really. It can be a waste of money. So then the both and I talk a lot about, we're neither certain nor is it chaotic. We're in a middle ground. Is, well, let's plan, but what would you do in a complex world? You've still got to plan. Your finance director wants a plan. So what do you do differently then if you know that things may not go to plan? Well, you review more often. You adopt a portfolio approach. You pilot. You have a range of stakeholders involved who are sensing into either the changes in the project or in the environment. Do you actually listen to people telling you that things are not going to plan? Or sometimes, I'm sure you've seen this, sometimes things go better to plan and they don't notice, because they've got the plan, so how do you both plan but attune to and have your radar out there, your antenna out to see what actually is happening? As opposed to, I've got a plan, I've chucked it over a wall and those people are implementing. So it's not, it doesn't seem as scary if you use those kind of words. You don't have to have a kind of intellectual discourse about the nature of uncertainty. You just get them to talk to you about what they've seen as uncertain and what are pragmatic ways of both planning, but reviewing more often, having more strands to your plan, adopting a portfolio approach or just making sure this is really a big one. I mean, people used to talk about managing by walking about. And, do we spend enough time just asking people, asking our sales guys or asking our customers, do you find anything new or different or interesting? Is anything changing? What isn't working? What is working? You don't have to, it doesn't have to take a lot of time just to have that relationships. And it's part of a leadership. I think it's part of what every leader should do. You have to build relationships such that you have that sensing into the wider context and you pick up those nuances of what's working, what isn't, and sometimes what's working better than you could have possibly imagined.
I really like what you're saying there, because it gives, to a certain extent, leaders that might be feeling overwhelmed a sense of agency as well, isn't it? Because often it's like complexity is this big thing out here, and anything that goes wrong, we'll just blame it on complexity. But what you're proposing there as well is that, do you know what, this all happens in the micro. You're just picking up on signals earlier. You're just getting people to understand that there's a lot more options available to them than there actually are, and it's not one and done. We're not fixed. We have to stay relatively sort of nimble in how we approach things. And
it does give you more agency. And I think, one of the unintended consequences of kind of, in a sense, a lot more data being available is I do think that managers have become much more nervous about doing things that they can't prove will work or they can't measure it has worked. Back in the day when there wasn't so much data, I think people were much more encouraged to be a bit entrepreneurial, to make judgments, to learn from doing. And I think it really behoves us in an organisation development sense to really develop leadership qualities that do help people to set an environment where you're saying to staff, well, try it out and see what happens. Come and tell me. Or anybody got any great ideas? What do you think isn't working? It's not rocket science. It's what you might do with your family. If you're trying to be a good parent, you try it out and see what happens. And it worked with that kid. It didn't work with that kid. You ask them what works. You have a relationship. Grandma gives her opinion, whether you want it or not. And, so it goes on, but we have to remember that organisations are the same thing. They're not a different kind of thing. I think those are natural leadership qualities that have got kind of beaten out of people into this kind of, I don't know whether if you know the work of Bill Torbett and the idea of developmental stages in the way people are. And what they talk about is that when we're younger, we want a more, in a way, a concrete, rational world. I used to keep notebooks with my pocket money in and what I spent it on and things like that. There's a sort of attention to data and a kind of desire for certainty. But as we go through more developmental stages, we get more comfortable with ambiguity. We get more comfortable with making judgments. We can take in wider information and make sense of it and see the patterns in it. And we've lost that ability because sometimes I've said to clients, I've walked away from clients who say, if the first question they ask me is how I'm going to measure its success, I think, oh no, it's not like it's a bad question, but they need to ask me, how are we going to do it? Do you see what I mean? What's your ideas about doing it? Not how are we going to measure its success? It's the wrong question to start with. It's a mechanical question. So I think there's something about how do we retrain people to do the things that they used to take for granted in our human nature and make them feel more confident about, trying things out, using their judgment, using judgment on complex subjective data. And I think this is why the word complexity is so difficult. If I say to my mum what's complexity, then she means, blah, 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 we know nothing, it's a mess, it's a complex world. What the science of complexity is saying is, but it's always patterned. There's always things going on that we can kind of tune into. And yes, we sometimes need to notice these growing shoots of change or collapses, but we don't have to know everything in order to know anything. That is not what we're saying with complexity. It's in some way, not that it was my choice, but it's not a very helpful word for what we're doing. If we called it the science of patterning, we'd have more traction. It doesn't sound as scary.
One of the terms you come up with in the book, which is a really nice one, I'm going to pronounce it, is sagacity. Is that right?
Probably.
I guess it talks about it's like what leaders have in terms of discerning what to do.
Yeah.
So know when to act, when to hold back, when to sense, when to interrupt.
Yes.
How do you learn that thing, or is it more of a sort of a felt sense? It's kind of sort of a tacit way of working.
So I think sagacity is it's the idea, the difference between knowledge and wisdom. The sage, and it's a great Taoist word, has developed wisdom. So it's, how do we develop wisdom in our lives? It might be all sorts of wisdom, the wisdom of how to hold yourself in difficult situations, or the wisdom of how to be a good parent or a good leader. It's partly an intention to cultivate yourself. This is a very Taoist view. We emphasize in our world a very transactional. What are you're a leader, how can I measure your outputs and outcomes in a way? But sagacity or wisdom, maturity, it comes over time through making mistakes, through getting feedback, through feeling safe, through being allowed the opportunities to experiment. So I think if we're wanting to develop our staff, we can set up a kind of culture of more, I was talking about it in this meeting I was holding yesterday, where people were talking about that we'd set up a space where people felt safe enough to disagree, or safe enough to give each other feedback. So as a leader, how do you decide to do that? How do you both encourage people, but encourage some dissent? Or there's a lovely phrase that one of the political writers used called agonistic dissent. And what she means is how do we set up a way in which we don't have conflict? It doesn't turn into conflict, but we feel safe enough to go, do you know what? I don't agree with that. I think you're wrong on that. And that's seen as a positive, as a kind of, it's done in a relational way. You haven't lost your relationship. So I think that sagacity is something that we need to, for organisation development people, we need to consciously help clients to develop and set up a safe enough space for people to experiment, get it wrong, and hone their judgment. So sometimes, for example, this is a particular form of this, but if we're doing a big mapping exercise about trying to understand the systemic, these hills and valleys I was talking about in the context, and they're saying, well, can you tell me precisely how to do it? And I'm saying, well, no, I can't really. It's like you're trying to look at things thematically, group Post-it notes, and they say, well, how do we know how to group them? And I'm saying, well, I don't really know. You'll have to talk to each other and see what seems to emerge. And people aren't used to that anymore. It's so they go through like, I hate this. I don't know what you're talking about. Can we have somebody new who doesn't ask us these awful things? But if you can help people and hold it there, that's when you start to gain confidence, isn't it?
Yeah, that role of holding space for people to work in that new way is really important.
Yeah, completely.
And not kind of short circuit this is too hard, do it for us, or give us a template or a structure or a framework that saves us from having to go through the pain. Yeah, so a lot of the organisations we work with are growing really quickly. So what are some of the things they can do to help them stay flexible as they grow?
Well, if you will let me just, I'd like to just go back one to build up to that. And one of the areas I used to do a lot of work in was organisation design. Interestingly, as a kind of OD strand of work, it's kind of gone out of fashion. How do you design an organisation? And I think it's something that's really interested me, and I think it's a kind of moving feast, and it's changing. How do you design structures that are adaptive? You have, to some extent with organisations as they get bigger. And one of the issues, as you know, with growing organisations, small entrepreneurial organisations often have very little structure. And then there's a sort of need for more clarity about who's doing what and that sort of thing. And that can be quite a painful process. One of the things I still think is useful is to try and get your head around what are the core business processes, what are the core processes that are needed in order to deliver an outcome to a customer or a beneficiary or whoever it is. Are you clear about what's supportive and what's key? And I think that sometimes the tail wags the dog, doesn't it? Usually finance, finance are bigger than HR. HR are quite big, but have we forgotten, where the flows? It's like, where are the flows? It's back to my, to that word that process complexity is a lot about understanding flows. So you're both trying to put some structure in that, but structure around the flows, around the natural way that an organisation needs to work to get stuff out efficiently and effectively to its beneficiaries or its customers. So if you grow, you need to kind of build in the ability to adapt as well. So that might be that you review quite often, are we in what ways is our world changing, and are we still adaptive to that? So you build in a kind of adaptive questioning, but sometimes you build in enough power in the organisation because, as you know, the difficulty with organisations is they become driven by power. So when people have got an empire, they don't want to let go of their empire. So how are you going to deal with that at the beginning when you think about it? How do you develop some shared power? Is it a sort of matrix where there's genuinely a tension in power structures that keep you on your toes a little bit without making it totally random? And are you doing that around the natural flow rather than what people regard as their hierarchies? They're not easy answers, but that work of assessing of how best to help an organisation structure itself and develop its processes, but in a way that's still responsive and doesn't, you have to name power, I think, a lot in this, because it's not that people don't know how to do that. It's often that just power gets in the way. Nobody dares tell the power seekers I learnt the hard way. I was doing some organisation design work many years ago. One of the senior directors looked at me in one meeting. He said, "You are trying to get rid of my job, aren't you?" And it's just, and I was quite young, and it's like, quite young. And funnily enough, he was really opposed to everything I did after that. It was very difficult. But how do you have that conversation about power and how you stop power getting in the way of an adaptive organisation? And when you say adaptive, I don't mean in a lot of this that it's endlessly adaptive. It's things aren't endlessly emerging, and we can't be endlessly adaptive. But we have to develop a way that deals with power. That ever so often we go, are we on track here, or are things getting in the way of us responding to a changing environment? I don't know whether that helps.
No, it is, because I think it sort of brings in an intentionality about it, because things often just become what they become. So people don't necessarily just assume loads of power in one shift. It's just a project at a time, or a bit of a movement of people very quickly, and all of a sudden it becomes a power block, doesn't it? But we often don't have the space, the courage, or the opportunity to do that, do we?
No. And I think it is one that, having people from outside, it is a place for consultants when you're actually getting an organisation to grapple with power, because, we can say it from the outside in ways that it's harder to say from the inside. And it is a real issue. I mean, some people argue, well, we don't. It's also true that the espoused design of an organisation is very different from what actually happens. So as a consultant, you have got to get into the informal processes and how decisions are really made and how work really flows, not the pretend version. So you are working as a consultant with the kind of, how do you harmonise in some ways? How do you get the formal and the informal to make more sense together? With one very large organisation I worked with, I remember, and again, I really like all my work in OD kind of works. I really want to talk to as many people as I can at different levels on their own. And, and people say things like, well, I've been here 2 years. I've finally worked out how to get a decision made. Some organisations, you say, can I see your organisation structure? And they don't have one. These are big global organisations. So, well, how do you know how to do things? Oh, well, you have to learn over years to, the machinations. And there's things like, sometimes one function, you'll have HR's global, supply chains are regional, and sales are local. And then the joint decision making doesn't happen because you've got power at different levels. And you've got, in the main, I think I'm of the view that in the main, you need to build enough systemic power at the level, at the place where things get sold to customers, that people there have the flexibility, and you build structures behind it, in terms of compliance and access to resources. But, you start to hear bonkers stories sometimes about, well, we've got to adhere to the global manufacturing standard, but we're in Indonesia and we can't get any engineers that are actually trained in using those machines. And anyway, the machines are too big for our market, and it almost gets lost in this globalization that looks efficient from a global manufacturing position, but isn't when you look at the whole business model. So in the main, I think going as close as you can to the customer and building an organisation systemically that can adapt there, and then backfilling it with the structures of support I'm sure 100 people would disagree with me about that, and there's many examples where that wouldn't work, but that's what's in my head generally in terms of what I've seen. But I wish this organisation design question would be more prominent again in OD work. I do think it gets sidelined.
Chris Moles writes about the importance of improvisation in organisations. So, a manager will give an edict saying, we will be doing this. And then it's down to those informal networks that you talk about, and how people will improvise to actually make things happen, and they'll bend a rule here, there, or all those things. Yes. And that's part of understanding the informal way an organisation actually works, isn't it?
Yes, but I think it's not enough. I'm not saying Chris is saying this, but it's not enough just to say, oh, well, that's okay then, that's the informal network. You want to facilitate a way of working that harmonises more the informal and the formal. Otherwise, you just end up with people who are very good at pretending things on one level and doing things at another level, and it's not very effective, or you see what I mean, so you need to be able to kind of surface and talk about the difference between the formal and the informal, and say, well, maybe we need to change the formal a bit, maybe this informal's really working well. So it's always true that you will improvise, but you can have cultures that support you. I want to be able to reward somebody if they've used. Oh, well, I'll just tell you this story. It was my mum was in hospital very poorly. She was moving hospitals. And when I was coming up by train, she lived in Yorkshire. And when I got to this second hospital, she'd been moved early. The ambulance had come early and I couldn't find her. I knew what ward she was in. I couldn't find her. So I finally track her down in this day room. My mother was a very strong northern, very strong character. Having hysterics, absolutely. I've never seen her like that, absolutely beside herself. And she'd been left in a day room with no food, no water, no medication for several hours. And I was a little bit cross, to say the least. And so I trot off to find somebody. And I have this ridiculous conversation, which is about, well, she hasn't been admitted. So, and I'm saying, okay, so, well, we haven't got a bed for her, so she couldn't be admitted. So we haven't admitted her, and therefore she can have no food, water, we can't take her to the toilet, we can't do anything. And the rule is, until they're admitted, you can't do anything. And because nobody was bothering taking out all stops to find her a bed, they didn't know anything about her. She just had an operation, she was in pain, she'd been on morphine, and there she was. And that's an example of where people get so captured by the formal system that they see no point in bucking the system and acting informally, because if anything happened, they'd get into trouble. You don't reward, the nurse wasn't rewarded by going to badger the doctor and saying, look, this lady's getting really distressed, we have to find a way of admitting her. Well, after I'd kicked up a bit of a fuss, they found a bed in 10 minutes and she we looked at her medication and we're all on track. But do you see what I mean? We end up, if we're not careful, with the power of the formal structure, people feel, and you can't blame the nurse, but it's not worth her while to buck the system, to use her initiative. It's not her fault if the patient dies. It would be her fault if she did something against the system. And that's where I think we've got this tension between the two. That's an example of where the formal structure worked. Sometimes the informal structure works, and then you get very clever people who wander around underneath the surface, and that's not effective either. So
it's a fairly big question, but when you look back at your career and your work, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned that you carry forward with you?
I think the importance of being myself. I think I've become more comfortable with the qualities that are me. I mean, I've changed. I do think we're always changing. I think I'm still changing and learning and growing. But authenticity seems really important, and I'm more effective and happier and generally more relational when I'm authentic, even when, some of that authenticity is a bit edgy or it's not polished. I don't try and be polished. I think I try and be real. And people, I think, genuinely respond to, authenticity in each other. So I think that's something that I've learned. I think I've got more confident in my instincts, as I've kind of developed. And you kind of try things out and see what happens. And if they work, you think you've learned something. I think my ability to deal with the big picture and complexity in that sense has developed. And I've learned better how to do that. And I think something I've found myself thinking and writing about more and more, really, and I don't know that it's learned, but it's certainly been reinforced, is this idea of, we are all connected, that in this world, if we want a resilient world, it has to be resilient for everyone. If we start acting at the expense of others, if we take and they have less, or if we're doing it in relation to taking from the planet, it won't work in the end. And seeing the moment that increasing inequality, that increase of, the continuing lack of respect for the planet, the way the climate is going, it's just something about love, relationship, care, respect, we're all in it together, has become really reinforced in me. And, one of the things that people talk about is about hope, for example, because, we live in a pretty dire world at the moment. The amount of awful things that are going on has never been so many in my lifetime. I have not in my lifetime seen things that are so awful in so very many ways, in terms of inequality, conflict, climate change, etc., rising populism, you name it. It's pretty dire. So, what gives me hope? Well, one thing that gives me hope is in an emerging complex world, you never know. So there's a sense in it might look dire, but then who'd ever thought we'd end apartheid or end slavery, or the Berlin Wall would fall? You go along, you think nothing's changing, and then all of a sudden things have been going on under the surface, and things do change and collapse. So complexity gives me hope in that sense, but in another sense, even if the hope is slight, there's me here and now. Like, all I've got control over at this moment in time is how I'm talking to you. Can I do that as well as I can with good heart? Can I give of myself, let you see me and be authentic, because that might be more effective in what I'm saying than if I'm kind of, talking through a blank screen. So it is like, in some ways, all we have to do, if I put it that way, is in this moment, there are opportunities to act well, to cultivate myself with others in mind, to think about the future. I can do this well or badly, and I might do it badly anyway, but I can intend to do it well. I can intend to do it with good heart. And I think that's something that I've learned to trust more. The end never justifies the means. It doesn't matter what you think you're doing. If you lie in order to achieve something, it's the lie that enters the system, and you might never get to the end point. So how do I act just now in this moment? Sometimes this moment might be very big. I might be talking to, a very senior person that really does have power, and I influence them. Sometimes it's something small. Sometimes you don't know whether it's big or small. But all I can do is do my best in this moment. And I do think that's something I've really come to believe in. And it's kind of releasing, really, because that's all I can do. I can just do my best now. I am worried about the future. I do things with an intention. The book ends with a kind of strong intention to consider some of these global issues. So that is my activism, as I say in the book, to try and write and bring some attention to that and some ways of dealing with it. But I'm released in the fact that all I can do is be myself in the moment and try and act towards you, and towards these questions in my best way, with open heart.
Jean, you're intensely well qualified. You have 3 master's degrees. You have a doctorate. But how do you invest in your own learning development? How do you stay sharp? We're admiring your bookcase, and that's only one of 3 bookcases around you, isn't it? 4, sorry. How do you invest in your learning? How do you stay sharp?
Oh, well, I loved. Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm thinking, for example, about, I find myself thinking about new writing, and I've been thinking about the kind of being more explicit, exploring more the idea of the inner and the outer world, and thinking about something that the Presencing Institute have talked about, 4th person knowing. This is sort of transpersonal knowing. So I read something, somebody sends me something. I thought, well, that's really interesting. How do I find out about that? I'm in study groups and book clubs. We've just been studying Alfred North Whitehead, who's a process philosopher, and working, meticulously through a book. I've been to sort of personal development type things. I went on a Buddhist retreat for a week, where it's a lot to do with quietness and meditation and nature. So I'm always reading something new. I love talking to people. I mean, these kind of interactions I learn a lot from, just from your questions, or, when I'm teaching, like with undergraduates, they ask something and it's like a gobsmackingly obvious, simple question that I've never thought of, or they tell me a story that just blows me away about something. So I think it's approaching life as a learning. Something that the Taoists talk about is we should always be cultivating ourselves.
Obviously, we'd recommend people pick up your books and read those, but if people have kind of you've sparked an interest in what we've talked about today. Are there any particular books or podcasts or resources that you'd signpost people to?
So Chris Moll's work I would recommend. I think Chris looks at issues of paradox. I like the way he talks about things. His podcasts and his work's very good. I think that some of the people who are writing about relationality, I really like. I'm reading a book, which is not an easy read, but a book on relationality, for example. That's an interesting topic to look at. I love the work of Stuart Kaufman in the field of complexity, and he has lots of interesting podcasts as well. He does real ranty pieces about emergence or something, and I watched them 5 times. There's a fabulous book called Process Biology called Everything Flows. So I quite like going to these more philosophical thinking pieces, because I suppose I don't know whether I did say that, but I think if you change your mindset or your ontology or your metaphysics, even these big words, if you change the way you look at the world, then in a sense finding methods and doing things differently seems more obvious. It's the bit that's hard to change, is the way you understand the way the world is. So I think Einstein said, you don't change anything unless you change the way you look at things. Books that make me think about that. And it's also, it's not necessarily reading and thinking, it would be talking. I was decided I don't do enough creative things I write and I sing, but I've been making collage Christmas cards, and it's terrific, and it somehow expands my mind in a different way. And the visual, I'm really interested in the way that art, some of the pieces in this book, talk about the role of art and poetry in looking at things. So if you're looking to expand yourself, go in odd directions. Don't go down a rabbit hole. Don't go, I know about this, I want to find out more. Go sideways. What's poetry got to do with this? What can we learn from that? Storytelling. I went to this absolutely wonderful talk last week by an author called Jeanette Winterson, and she's an author I've followed for years, and she's written a new book based on her thinking about the Arabian Nights, which is quite an Eastern. She was explaining it's a very different tradition from Western fairy tales, which are all about heroes and dragons and quests. And the sort of the more Eastern tradition is more about handling ambiguity and complexity and many things happening at once. It's quite Taoist in what she was describing. But she was talking about the role of the imagination. Now that's something I've started to read about. What is the role of the imagination? What does that mean? And she was talking about, we need different stories to the ones we have. Neoliberalism is a story. It's not a scientific fact. It's a story. We need sometimes to go back to old stories, and stories help to find another right brain, more embodied way of thinking about the future than, this sort of more concrete analytical. So I think that's what I would say to people. If you want to kind of develop your thinking, go off in odd directions and see connections.
Brilliant. There's so many, I don't know about you, Danny, but my reading list has gone up tenfold. There's some really lovely references in there. And the last question from us for the podcast, and a question that we ask every guest, because one of the original missions of the podcast to inspire the next generation of organisation development practitioners coming through. And I guess I'm going to give you a 2-pronged question. You can pick which thread you'd like. What advice would you either give someone who's getting started in organisation development? So maybe they're frustrated with the way things are, or maybe they're seeing complexity and going, I don't really know. I've listened to the podcast and I've been really intrigued with these brilliant descriptions and articulations of it. What advice would you give them if they're just starting out?
Really work out what you think. Don't go along with things because somebody else tells you it's professional or the right way of doing things. What do you think? Who are you and what do you think? What matters to you and what have you learned in your life? And then find like-minded people to work with that you can learn from, but that affirm your nature and your kind of starting point, because you will through life be able to deal with people who are very different from you. But if you're starting off, find like-minded people, of different ages and backgrounds, but feel comfortable in being yourself in that, and then learn from that position. But if you're thinking, this is really weird, I don't like any of this is not for me, then listen to your gut about that, because we do know we often have that beaten out of us by organisational processes and what's regarded as norms. But, norms are only today's stories. They don't last forever. So I think, find out who you are, find like-minded people and learn with them. And then, when you're more established, it's easier to kind of work out how to flex out of that. That would be my advice. And do it across ages. I love working, and engaging with people from different age groups and backgrounds, in terms of ethnicity, places in the world that they live. The more you can kind of find ways of engaging with people who are different from you. At the same time, if this isn't a paradox, finding people who you resonate with. They're slightly different, aren't they? You can resonate with people who are different.
Jean, I want to say a huge thank you. I'm so happy you said yes to our invitation. I've been really excited about this. Those that know me will know that I'm a physics geek. And I was just so excited to have someone who has such a breadth and feet in different worlds as well. Mm-hmm. And what you've done is you've brought together what is potentially intimidating or misdefined subject. And you brought a real elegance to it and a real accessibility to it as well. And I think that's really reflective in your writing as well. So we really encourage people to read your books, and we'll put links to both of your books in the show notes below. We really encourage you to read them as well. They're really great, aren't they, Danny?
They are fabulous. Yep.
Brilliant. So, Jean, we want to say a huge thank you. If people want to follow your work, if they want to just keep us up to date with the latest thing, what's the best way for people to get in contact?
Well, I've got a website, embracingcomplexity.com, which has not only, access to the two main books, but I've also written a number of book chapters and articles and more formal presentations. So there's access, and a lot of them are just downloadable from the website. There's articles. There's also a great list of podcasts and presentations and other stuff that if people want to listen to it. And you can also sign up for a blog. I've got a whole blog series going on there, and you can sign up, or you can contact me via the website. And if people contact me, I do get back to them. I'm also quite active on LinkedIn. I quite like LinkedIn. But, if people are interested, please do contact me, because I like it. I feel like I've got all these new pen pals and friends all over the world. And it's just, that's how I learn and keep fresh, so don't, it would be lovely to hear from people.
Brilliant. Well, you're now officially a friend of our podcast now. So, and that website is brilliant. We do a lot of preparation for these sessions. So we've read your book, we've consumed all of your online material, and it's a really great reference. And it's a great place to keep coming back to as well, because you keep adding to it as well. And I've really enjoyed it. I've been introduced to the term agonistic disagreement, sagacity, designing for the formal and the informal. And I think you did a mic drop definition at the end, which I love, which is norms are only the stories of today. I think that's such a lovely way of describing it. Oh, it's so good. I don't know you, but Danny, I'm having a sleepless night tonight just thinking about all the things that Jean's raised today. Brilliant. So we want to say a huge thank you, and thank you to everyone who is tuning into all of our podcasts. We're so pleased with the response we're having. We keep adding more countries all of the time, and we have such lovely feedback on the guests that we have, and we know that Jean's going to go down extremely well. So if you have enjoyed this podcast, what we're always impressed with is the number of shares that we have. So if you're watching this and you're thinking there's someone, a manager who's a little lost, or an OD practitioner that maybe need to have a new insight on complexity, please do share this podcast. I know there'll be so much value in it as well. And hit the like button, because the algorithm gods love it. But most of all, importantly, Jamie, we want to say a huge thank you. You've been so generous with your time, your generosity of experience and insight as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been lovely. I've enjoyed it, and you've been absolutely lovely to engage with. So I appreciate your warmth and generosity of spirit as well.